everyone. This is Jill Hurston with CenterZip. I'm going to introduce our host today, Mike Watson. He's our VP of Engineering. Mike, let's turn this over to you.
All right, thanks, Jill, for that introduction. So yes, I'm Mike Watson, VP of Engineering at CenterZip. Been hosting a few of these Zip chats. If you've been on them before, you've seen me doing the same shtick. Today we have a slightly different format. We're due to some time zone challenges, we really want to include Vinayak, who's a key participant in our top 10 events historically. We've recorded sessions, both Hemit's sessions and Vinayak's sessions separately, with the three of us on there in an engaging, interactive conversation. So a little bit of different format. It's going to run a little bit longer today. It's probably going to go 1 hour and 5 minutes approximately. Plus or minus a little bit, depending on how much I ramble here. With me today is Hemit Elhens. He's the CEO of CenterZip, and he's here to tell us a little bit about why we do Agile Top 10 and how it got started. Hemit, over to you.
Sounds good. Thanks, Mike. Welcome, everyone. So the reason we've been doing these for 10-ish years, Agile Top 10, is Vinayak and I have been attending the conference for all these years. And in the early years, we realized when we go to this conference, which has been in many cities, as some of you have attended, there were probably 1,500 to 2,000 attendees in these, typically in this Agile, big Agile international conference. And when we would come, we'll find very few people from our Dallas or Austin or Houston ecosystem would be there in person. So we thought it was a good way for us to give back to our community of Agile practitioners in each of these cities, in our Dallas area where I am, or where our clients are in Austin as well as Houston. So just distill our top 10 from having spent a week at the conference and share it as a give back to the community in each of these cities. So that was the original reason. And one thing which is interesting, we realized within a year or two of doing that, we started getting a lot more out of it, Vinayak and I, because we would commit ahead of time to do these top 10. Now we were on the hook to actually attend these entire conference in a very engaged fashion to pick our top 10 and to do justice to the content. So we realized we were getting a lot more out of it too ourselves because of having made the commitment of sharing those 10. So that's the kind of how it started, and we've been refining it ever since. And this year, since there was no real Agile conference in person thanks to COVID-19, we thought, no, this is a wonderful opportunity for us to reflect on last 10 years of top 10 and pick core ideas that seem to be really robust and share those. And what a wonderful opportunity for us to have to retrospect on previous 10 years of top 10. So that's kind of the background for this year's session.
Yeah, thanks for that, Hemit. And I know last year you couldn't attend, and so Florence and I attended in your behalf, and it was a quite intense experience, going with a focused approach, going to sessions, taking copious notes, and then building all of our content and turning that around right afterwards. It definitely made that content stick. Like, it felt like I learned a lot more from that experience than normal conference attendance. So yeah, I could definitely see why that would be a benefit.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, with no further delay, we're going to move on to the recorded content that we have. In between the two sections, I will, come on and transition there. But one other thing I want to remind you of is that we do have the ebook available as a handout, which you can download right now and follow along with the topics if you'd like, or you can grab it later, and I'm sure it'll be part of the materials that come out post. So again, without further delay, let's move right into the recording.
All right, Mike, thanks. So let me share what I think as my top 10 takeaways looking back, what 10-ish years of these Agile top 10s that we have done in these Agile Alliance conferences. So here's a list I just put on one page, and then I'll go one by one, and what we have and I have in each of these takeaways, in many cases multiple pages, but I'll just keep the pace up And you guys, ask any questions. Mike, if as a moderator, if you have any questions that need to be explained or anything, or Vinayak, if you feel anything needs to be amplified, but I'll keep the pace to get through all 10 of them. So my first one is actually the topic of technical debt, and I've annotated, as you see here, the years as far as possible where this came up as a takeaway. So this has been a very important and useful kind of a terminology and a framework that we find in Agile community. It came up, I think, first in 2011 with Israel Gutt talking about it and many others. And the key concept of technical debt has really helped raise the conversations in the management team, especially between the CTO or the VP of engineering who is leading engineering teams and their peer C-level executives like a CFO or a CEO often, about the nature of software development and what is technical debt, what it is, and all that. So it really has made the right discussions happen. And I find earlier we used to have these concerns on this topic, whether there's a concrete definition of what goes into technical debt or not. How do you, is there a way to quantify it in a meaningful way or not, and all that. And all that has gone away. And what has really helped is the fact that for the most people in the finance industry, and let me advance the page and get to this page, which we showed this as one of the pages, that it has become very widely well understood that what is technical debt, how do you quantify it. Almost every engineering team seems to follow it. Every C-level executive seems to understand it. And the fact that it is parallel to the financial debt, and therefore has a notion of, if you don't pay it off, it accrues interest and makes it harder for you to be a healthy company, is a very good parallel that seems to work well. So that's our first, my first kind of a takeaway. Again, they're not in a particular order though. So let me go to second one now.
Yeah, Hemant, on the point of
Yeah.
the financial debt, technical debt thing, that was actually very interesting when that first came up. I think I remember attending a session where you talked about this right after the Agile conference.
Right.
It was eye-opening for me. Yeah. Completely made sense because I have a little bit of a financial background.
Absolutely, absolutely. This has been very helpful. In fact, this is the one idea which has allowed CFOs to really connect with the CTOs. Right. Because they really understand this notion of debt. And when CTO has to debate a engineering budget and what needs to be paid off by re-architecture because technical debt, CFOs now understand it. So it's been very useful construct. Absolutely. So moving on to the second takeaway, which is this notion of how do you estimate effort in form of time or dollar cost for a software project or a significant release, even for that matter. So we covered this in multiple conferences going back to 2014, 17, 18, and 19 even, and maybe even a few others. The main takeaway is that while there is certainly a value of what teams often do, what I'm calling here, or most people call bottom-up estimate, which is task by task, story by story. The team sits around using some form of planning poker or something and doing an estimation exercise. But in reality, when you look at the data, and there's multiple instances of it, it is not very useful exercise for the management planning purposes. What management needs is some way to plan for time and budget and set expectations for the downstream activities and all that, and have capital budgeting exercise. For all of those management purposes is not a useful exercise. What's more useful is the empirical approach to estimation using real recent empirical data of that team. So that's the key takeaway. I'll hit a few highlights in the form of some of the visuals we have used in the past in these takeaway. So the key reason that the bottom-up estimate doesn't work, and this is all attributed to Troy Magenis' work, most of it actually, and you guys can go look him up. He's a lot of public, very useful information, is the fact that individual developers actually ignore accounting for the delays and dependencies between on their work, and they're generally optimistic. So two stories, one which may be 1-point estimate and another 13-point estimate, still may take 20 minutes, for example, because of the wait times and all that. So that's the point, and I'm going to skip through some of these pages. So Troy has.
Hemant, it is interesting that you call it empirical instead of calling it top down. So any reason why you don't call it top down?
Well, yeah. So because the data here is empirical in the sense what this spreadsheet that Troy has shared, and it is publicly available. Essentially, he recommends you take recent 10 data points of that team, that the work they have done, and you use that actual data of when they got done and how long it took to help predict your new project. So it's very much empirical. It is not top down. I mean, you may still apply a top down management judgment, but you're using statistical approach of Monte Carlo simulation to allow for variability that is inherent in software work. So that's why I use the word empirical, because it is based on statistical estimation exercise. So I'm going to keep moving. Vinayaka and Mike, you guys chime in if you feel something needs to be clarified here. Okay, so here shared the spreadsheet, and I'm going to not dwell on it, but the main kind of net takeaway is that when forecasting, using historical data of your team, whether you're using velocity or throughput or some such actual data, just use recent 10 samples, because taking more longer historical data is actually worse, because you might think you have more data, but the context has changed, the team has changed, or the complexity of your domain has evolved and all that. Just take, and that's the key, to take just recent 10 samples of team's performance over the recent projects, and that's good enough. So that's the main advice and takeaway. Let's keep moving to the next third takeaway that I have, which is a very important one: what metrics you should track for your Agile team. So this one comes down to, essentially, I'm also attributing this to Troy. You will see a lot of Troy's influence on my takeaways for sure. That it boils down to this tweet that he did, very succinct, that in metrics, just look for trends, not numbers. Do it at team level, not individual team member level. Don't look at a single metric, but look at balanced number of metrics and apply it in context. And essentially tell me when I need to worry. And that's very sound advice. So what it boils down to, when you look at all the various advices across the years on Agile conferences, I boiled it down to 4 key metrics that every Agile team should follow. So one is a metric around quality, how well you're delivering to your customer satisfaction. For example, escape defect that get into production. That's a good metric. Just count those. Second is a measure of productivity and responsiveness, typically a cycle time measure, which is, from the time a story starts to the time it is done, measure that. That's a good measure. Third is some measure of a predictability, which is how reliable is a commitment team is making. A good one is planned to done ratio for every sprint, and that's a good one to one. And final balanced one to bring a total balance into team metric is a happiness and the team health, so that you can strive. And there's no specific guidance, but you can measure it using some form of a fist of 5 or whatever is good, but some measure of team health. So you're following a sustainable pace, not burning the team out. So that's the basic guidance on team metric. And here's a visual to bring it to life. If you have in a team room some sort of a chart, then maybe you can use something like these 4 to keep an eye on all 4 considerations. So that's it for the, I guess, the metric part. Let's move to the next takeaway.
So Hemant, I do have something to add. So I was able to join last year, and you had to skip. And one of my takeaways was related to this, just to put a point on the metrics. So the predictability, one of the things they talked about is predictability of velocity. So trying to reduce variance in these metrics. So, is it possible to get, similar velocities over time? Because that shows, great predictability versus trying to figure out what your velocity will be or trying to increase it. But if you can get predictability in the velocity, then that actually gives you higher confidence.
Yeah, that's an important point, because from management perspective, they need to be able to know if they can rely upon the velocity enough to do time estimate that how long will this project take. And you're right, if it is predictable, then they can, otherwise they can't. You're exactly right. Yeah, so but these are good summary for kind of a way metrics to track a team, whichever one you may pick in each quadrant, but pick one in each quadrant is a general advice and key takeaway. All right, let's move on to next one. Number 4 in my list was this topic of role of product owner. It came at least a couple of times again, probably more. First time was when Jeff Patton, who is a thought leader on this topic of role of product owner anyways, he talked about these 3 overlapping kind of Venn diagram of the product needs to be valuable, what you build, the feature, and that's a determination done by product owner to pick the right story and prioritize it appropriately. And the UX person make sure it is designed in a usable way, and then of course the development team make sure it is built and can be built. So the important point comes out in this other session a few years later, which is the role of product owner is not a single ringable neck, which is often some teams think of it, a product manager, product owner, as a single ringable neck for prioritization of what features get built. I think that's the takeaway here is that's not a reasonable expectation at all. You should think of product owner as a facilitator for your stakeholders. So your stakeholders, whether they're customers, your investors, or even your management team, or your analyst, whoever you have, we consider stakeholders. They have to take their inputs and based on those inputs prioritize the backlog and work as a facilitator, and they become essentially the value team facilitator to prioritize the backlog so that the delivery team can work on the highest value story next. So think of product owner as a facilitator, not a single ringable neck. That's an important takeaway in this case. Let's move to next one, which is the role of architecture and architect. This is widely debated and still difficult to reconcile, frankly, in many of the agile teams which are practicing. So in this case, the guidance this came from a number of people across multiple years as usual, which is think of architecture as a shared responsibility. There's no kind of an ivory tower role of an architect in good, well-running agile teams. And you just define the system characteristics at a high level, be very specific about it, whether it's performance or scalability and whatever those are, and roll your architecture stories into regular backlog and user stories. And this one visual I think was very helpful, that to the full continuum extreme of all the design up front in a classical waterfall to a completely cowboy kind of a do architecture as you go. I think the best is this notion of emergent architecture, where some architecture decisions you do make up front, and what you do probably is just do one day of an architecture, make sure the big rock picture architectural topics are ironed out, and then you don't need a full sprint 0 or architecture sprint. And that's the advice and key takeaway on the architecture topic.
Yeah, this is something that we, so I helped a client launch a product and form their team. This is something we focused on is using architecture as research stories. So as features came up that required some thought, we would put that into the backlog for the next sprint or cycle, and as research tickets, and we would track those just like any other tickets to conclusion. And then once those were done, it would inform the actual feature development. Sometimes changing it, sometimes the acceptance criteria needed to change, but I really liked that concept and it worked well in this case. Excellent
point. In fact, this visual speaks to that, which is keep your architectural work visible on your backlog. And I think this was from another year of Agile conferences, and I've attributed to the right presenter there, which is if you label it what you just said, Mike, which is your yellow part, the invisible architecture feature, just color code your backlog so you know it is architectural story you need to get done. It is a significant, drives positive value, so the team knows. So in every sprint, you have a mix of all these 4 colors of your stories. You're paying off some technical debt, you're doing some visible, external, usable features, you're building some architecture components in there, and of course fixing defects. So that's a very good way to think about architecture. All right, moving on to next one, in the interest of time, the team composition. So how do you compose? This has been a topic that has gone a lot of discussion over this decade of as agile maturity across the globe has evolved. So a few highlights that stood out to me as I reflected on last many years of agile guidance across conference years. One is distributed agile teams across the time zone has become the norm. That wasn't the case in the early years, but is more and more and become almost a standard and default now. And it's quite common to have a product team which has 2 Scrum teams in Austin, 1 in Colorado Springs, and 2 in Pune, India. Typically, for example, in our client cases, become very common. And but the other part also become well understood, and the data has supported that is stable and dedicated teams result in better productivity and predictability. And we talked about predictability, Mike, when he brought up a velocity, and this is very important. So strive to keep your teams stable and dedicated to a class of features or a product component or whatever it is. Then the other one has come across is this size of team. You got to balance the team size. Why is the 2 pizza team that has often been talked about, 7 plus minus 2 is still a good rule of thumb. But if there's so many dependencies between team, dependencies is a big problem in software development, as we all know. So err on the side of a larger team if that allows you to avoid a dependency between 2 teams. So make it a 1 team. So that's important guidance and takeaway. And typical team ultimately boils down to this guidance. You have 1 product owner. Typically, you have 4 developers, whether they're full stack or front end, back end differentiated. We see them both. 2 testers, typically UX, half time or full time, and then of course DevOps and a Scrum Master. So that's typical team of 7 plus minus 2 is a typical team mix, in case you're still wondering, although this is pretty well understood now. So I'm going to skip through these visuals. This illustrate the same point that I mentioned, but I left the pages in here if someone who receives this document wanted to look up. This is a very good treatment of the dependency topic, again attributed to Troy Magenis, that he did this work. And dependency is a big issue. So merge teams or create bigger teams or co-locate team next to each other if there's dependency in each other. That's a very important way to deal with the dependency topic. I'm going to skip I already covered the typical team. That's just more detail. The next topic I want to cover in my highlight is value over cost. This is a topic that has come up a few times, but seems to still get ignored. So most teams don't spend as much time, effort in estimating the value of a story as they often spend the time estimating the cost of that story, meaning story points or time and all that. So the guidance is to actually at least balance the 2 considerations. So one way to do that is to do value estimation with stakeholders. And you can do a planning poker similar session, but use value points. And this came up in one of the years where you, just like you do story points for effort, but do 2 very independent exercises. So you don't commingle the 2 things. And then once you have the value estimate, just like the previous page, I talked about the role of product owner. If with the value stakeholders, you come up with value points for each story, and then with the engineering team, you come up with the story points for the effort estimate. Now you can create the grid of high value, low cost stories, which of course you should do first, and high value, high cost stories, and so on. So it allows you to actually attend to the story, the value dimension of each story, which is often ignored. And then, of course, the data supports, this has come up a few times in many sessions at Agile Conference, that only 25% of all the stories are high value. Most of them are. So it's important to put your attention to high value stories. This is a session that's very early year. I forget which year, maybe 2014, 15, very early years. I call them early years because that's when we started regularly attending the conference. Jim Smith and Pat Reed did a session where they actually talked about mapping value points to the net present value calculation of a project. So a CFO would love this idea that when you're justifying a project based on a financial argument of a net present value, you just take that, in this example of 5 million net present value, and equate it to some arbitrary number, let's say 5,000 value points, and now you got a bucket and you can equate value points to a real dollar value of the project and work at it that way. And then you start following the chart of value burn up chart along with the story points burn up chart as you do. So a very important takeaway and a practice, but not often followed in our opinion. But number 8.
Hang on, I have a quick thought on that. So, or a question actually for you. In this for either of you, Vinayak or Hemant, have you attended any sessions where they talk about how, like the skew of value, like your internal view in a company of the value of features might be different than the external view, and how do you rationalize that? Because a lot of like that mechanism, the thing that I was thinking about is you're probably going to mostly sample internal employees of your company that may have a different view of like what value means, right, than your actual customers. And so reconciling that.
No, I think you're right. That's inherent probably in the value aspect, because even if you only prioritize, you would argue the same thing, whether you can prioritize from internal perspective and a product owner versus if you were to take an external direct input. I don't know if there's any additional guidance I remember, Mike, on this topic. I come back to essentially the same argument, which is let a product owner as a facilitator reconcile these viewpoints of external, internal, and all that, and let them be the kind of be the facilitator to come up with a median, a reasonable kind of a viewpoint.
Yeah, I wasn't expecting you to have a magic answer. I was just wondering if you heard anything about that particular problem, because it's very interesting.
Yeah, I haven't, nothing beyond what I just said. The only other thing that I want to amplify again is the takeaway here is that most teams don't even bring it up as a discussion. I mean, they would at best prioritize, and that is very loose prioritization as we often see in teams. But bringing a level of discipline and rigor, they'll do so much time estimating the story point or the time estimate, but completely gloss over the value component. And the guidance takeaway is to bring some semblance of balance on the two sides.
Yeah, the focus on value is great. I really think it's a good idea.
Yeah, I think most teams often gloss over that and just keep running on delivery. Okay, going to the next one, this holy grail of acceptance test driven development, or its cousin, behavior driven development. This has been a very important topic that came up some years ago, which is upfront, because so much of clarity of requirements can be pushed upstream if you can. And this chart on the right was a good way. I know you have seen many times that the cost of fixing a defect is way higher, several orders of magnitude higher when it is in production post-release, right? So if we can push the clarity of the intention of the story upfront at the design stage or the requirement stage by having this amigo review of a product owner and a developer and a tester sitting together and coming up with an acceptance test, so that they're all clear, that the developer is clear what they're going to build, the tester is clear what they're going to test, and the product owner is very clear of the intent of that story. That's a time well spent, but often ignored. So this is a loop you follow. You write an acceptance test, and then you develop, and if it works, you then worry about the refactor kind of topic. Otherwise, but the acceptance test doing upfront, whether you use the acceptance test driven development or the behavior driven development, both are related techniques. I won't go into them now, but it dramatically improves the productivity of the team. But the observation, of course, is that most teams have a hard time getting to this cadence, following this practice actually. So this is a mind.
Hemant, to add to that, I would say that even if you don't actually execute the automated acceptance tests, even writing the acceptance criteria explicitly, at some point you would automate it, but even before that, even if you write it down, that itself is of high value.
That's a great point. It pushes for that clarity. So the hurdle, you're right, Vinayak, that's what we have seen. The hurdle is higher to automate, but the hurdle to at least have the discipline to write acceptance criteria on your story card is definitely a good practice that all teams should follow. That just requires discipline, absolutely. So this is a common triangle widely agreed now, this pyramid of that you have large number of unit tests at the bottom, and then behavior driven test, and then end-to-end acceptance test, and all that have a lot more of those tests at the bottom and fewer at the top. So that makes a lot of sense in this guidance. And I'll just highlight this was a keynote a few years ago by Jess Humble, and he talked about essentially the net takeaway was, until you have test automation, and to Vinayak, your point, which is if you can get to that discipline, which you're not only writing acceptance test, but actually automating it also, so you can run it through every regression cycle, you tremendously free up capacity for innovation. In this example of real study that he did with HP LaserJet project, that 40% of development capacity got freed up for new work because a lot of the mundane work got automated of that manual testing and with test automation and other overhead. So just sound advice to follow that practice. Okay, my number 9 takeaways is this observation of following agile values and agile practices outside of software development. So this has been growing kind of a movement essentially. We observe it all around. It has get discussed in the Agile conference that at the executive level is clearly now there enough evidence between Harvard Business Review writing about it and McKinsey writing about it and all that. But in other functional areas also, marketing is usually the next one right after development. Most organization which finds it valuable to follow agile practices. And then of course HR starts following it, finance has been following it, and then of course the whole discussion around business level agility, how you can respond to market more quickly because the entire organization is now more agile and following agile values. So that's the other takeaway that stands out. I'm going to skip through these visuals right now. You can look through them. The only one that is interesting is this version that came at one of the previous conferences about using Agile Manifesto and applying it to marketing. So for example, validated learning over opinions and conventions in marketing. So that's just an illustration of how you apply that in marketing. All right, and I'm going to skip through HR. My last one, number 10, is this pervasive topic of scaling frameworks. The main takeaway here that stands out to me is after many years, and this, I look back at the data, 2014 was the first year that this topic even came up in Agile conferences. And I think that was the year SAFe, Scaled Agile Framework, became public. And I think that brought a little more structure to this discussion. And since then, now there's at least half a dozen between Scrum of Scrums and large scale Scrum and disciplined Agile delivery and Spotify model came in for a while and went away as a scaling model. And the Nexus came recently, another one. So net, it turns out the scaled Agile framework seems to be the most popular. And this data I took from the most recent, there have been recent 14 years of state of Agile practice surveys that are done used to be done by version 1. Now I forget who does it. But in any case, the current takeaway, the 35% people say they follow SAFe, and the Scrum of Scrum, which is the next biggest, is 16%. And if you look back just the few years ago, which was the first year in this data, in 2014, SAFe was the first, when it came up, was 19% that year. And that was the first year that State of Agile report actually covered this topic. And that time, Scrum of Scrums was the most dominant. So my main takeaway is SAFe seems to hold on in spite of a lot of what I should say, resistance and pushback from people thinking it is too burdensome and too structured, but seems to stick. So that's it, Mike, for my top 10 that I reflected back from last 10-ish years of Agile conferences. Over to you.
All right, so that was, you were just listening to Hemant in a pre-recorded conversation with Vinayak and myself. As you probably know, if you've attended any of these top 10 events, that Hemant tends to focus more on the organizational and process level issues, and Vinayak, who's coming up next, being the CTO of CenterZip and one of the co-founders, he obviously tends to more focus on the technical aspects. So with that, let's jump into Vinayak's conversation.
Thanks, Mike. So I'm going to have my presentation broken into 4 broad areas. So first I'll talk about the trend that I see in Agile architecture throughout the conferences through the last 10 years or so. Then we'll talk about the lean thinking, whether it's lean startup or lean UX, the way it evolved over these years. Then we'll talk about DevOps. And finally, we'll talk about the way Agile organization and thinking about Agile culture has evolved over these years. So first off, let's start about Agile architecture. And it started way back in 2010. And the overall trend I'm going to talk about is that Agile architecture is something where there's not an architect who's doing that, but it's a developer architect who's playing that role of an architect. So in 2010, this concept of architect doing big design upfront, or Yagni as they used to call it, where an architect would build the whole thing up with all the bells and whistles and hooks baked in, and if someone asks him why is this there, he would say that, look, you're going to need it. And he would have that overarching premonition that whatever is needed 5 years from now, he would try to put it there in the architecture. Now that thinking evolved now to wait till the last responsible moment to make any architectural decisions and let it evolve. The main reason is that architecture by and large depends on what the requirement is, and requirements themselves evolve over a period of time. As one would see that customers not really ready with the stories, and as things evolve, the customers really learning on the job, and there's overall lack of big picture that is needed to do upfront design. So that is the overall thinking in the Agile community, if you will, and that's the way Yagni and BDUF have given way to LRM. So moving on, really speaking, it's the good code and craftsmanship practices that is influencing architecture more than the traditional architecture, as we all know. So, some things like encapsulation, writing code for testability, very important, because testability forces you to break down your code into modules, if you will, and making each module defining its responsibilities and providing well-defined interfaces so that the tester can test it. So making it testable, because you have only 2 weeks in a sprint. So what is the tester going to test tomorrow if I'm writing this code today? This thinking is very important. So automatically that results into good architecture. And all these rules like favoring aggregation or inheritance, self-documenting code, programming by intention, and I'll skip over these visuals. So generally favoring aggregation or inheritance. And one rule that is very important: if you have 2 entities, let's say A and B in a system, then you can either have A uses B or you have A makes B. You can never have both. So these are some of the rules and guiding principles that if you follow and write testable code, as I said earlier, by and large, you will get good architecture as a result of that. Instead of an architect having to tell what it should look like, and then a developer following what the architect says. So that's the overall thinking. And again, we already seen this, and I've stolen this slide, Hemant, from you. So, the evolution happened from waterfall to big design upfront. So waterfall is like, it was initially you do all the design and architecture, and then you hand it over to the development team, and then the development team does it in all the sprints. BDUF is you have some sprints reserved for big to do the design. So maybe 1 or 2 sprints where you just do design. Then sun-up is within the sprint, you reserve a couple of days where you do design upfront, and then the emergent architecture where you're doing designing and architecting all throughout the sprints. And of course, finally, cowboy means you don't do it at all. So that's the way from the left to the right is showing the kind of emergent architecture, how it evolves. Around 2016, microservices was a hot topic, and like everyone was wanting to build, and architects, at least those who were wearing architects hat, wanted to have this all microservices kind of thing. And so this is something which is very eye-opening, where you can't have you just don't start with all microservices. You start with something. It's again coming back to the point of evolution. So architecture evolves. You start with something that is unstructured, and it evolves into namespaces, and then you are always dependent. You can't do everything yourself. You can't reinvent the wheel. There are libraries available, so you're going to use libraries, external libraries, or managed services. And then what you do is you mix and match, and then peel out certain areas which can be very can be standalone to do one thing well, as they say, and then define and build microservices around those. So then you have all of that, like you have applications, you have libraries, and you have microservices. So that's the continuum. So it's not like you start with all microservices. It's an evolutionary approach. You start with something that is unstructured and end up with a mix and match of all that. And
so
at the same time,
Vinayak, I have a couple of thoughts on that. It actually, based on my experience, it totally makes sense to evolve it that way. This prevents you from making waste. Like you were talking about in the big upfront design, you might build architectural features that are not needed, and that could include microservices, right? Like you've made two fine-grained microservices or something like that, because you thought that might be what you needed to do, but you find out your company pivoted to a year later, and like all of a sudden this extra work you've done goes away. And the other thing is, don't build what you don't have to, right? That's a good use of managed services and libraries. I think it's an important thing, because that also is waste. If you build things that someone else has already built as a commodity, then you're wasting your time.
Yeah. So there is always this conscious decision that the team has to make against some of the developers who are very passionate about using the new and shiny tool that they have just discovered. So we have to keep economics and also what is prudent in terms of business in mind, and take these decisions. So moving on, around the same time, the 12-factor app, and I can swear by it even today, that all these principles of when parallel processing and simultaneously you have things happening on the cloud with multiple containers orchestrated by Kubernetes-like orchestration. So for those, this 12-factor microservices app became the norm around that time. So first mention of the lean thinking or the lean startup or the lean UX thinking was way back in 2013 when Aviva Rosenstein talked about rapid research. And I would like you to, I'd like to draw your attention to one thing that she said there, that user research is too important to be left to user researcher, right? It's the development team that has to actually own user research as well. So that's the year when we started as Agile development teams looking at personas, user roles, empathy maps and card sorts and all those things which were so far not really, we never always thought of user research as something that used to be taken up by the user researchers or UX designers sitting in their ivory towers, and we never really thought of going into details. But as from this year on, a lot of the presentations that we heard in the Agile conferences talked about how teams can adopt the way user research can be done within the team. And one of the things that we later will see is that having publishing the user research to the entire team so that the team starts talking in terms of the user personas, and that becomes the lingo of the team. So moving on, the lean thinking, it percolated into all areas. Whether it didn't remain only limited to uh, development, but also hiring. So in 2015, we had a session where we talked about lean hiring as a concept, and moving on, it also started percolating in areas where developers themselves started doing participating in research. And as you can see, as you might be able to see in this picture that you have here, that developers are heads down attending to the tickets that they are getting in Zendesk, and they going down and checking what the users are thinking about the software that they build, and they're incorporating the user experience suggestions that are coming as a part of that. So the entire team is fully involved, and it's not like so like I said earlier, even in the case of architecture, it's the developers who do it, and there's no specific architect who's doing it. Similarly, in this case, there is no user experience designer, but it's the development team that is doing the UX design themselves, and that's the evolved thinking. And as you can see here, as Elizabeth I said in her this thing. So this new slide that you see here, slide 66, which talks about in this session that research is published, making it freely accessible to the team, and that's the important part. So the whole team is involved in the build, measure, and learn loop, and so you have the same language being spoken across the team. So developers are participating. So it's the agile development team that is doing. With that, let's move on to DevOps. So the DevOps journey was equally interesting. It started with the keynote address by Gene Kim. Gene Kim is the author of the famous book, The Phoenix Project. So that year, Netflix was doing continuous delivery. They used to deploy several hundred times in a day, and that became the story, and everyone was kind of wanting to follow Netflix. Adrian Cockcroft came and said that, like, do more painful things more frequently. So if release is a painful thing, do it several hundred times in a day. And it was the talk of the town, and everyone was kind of really impressed by the way Netflix does things. And we all were like gung ho about going back and implementing continuous integration and continuous delivery in our organizations. And a lot of us started that journey in this year. And it was all about tools, like big cross-functional teams instead of the DevOps team, building a pipeline, architecting, taking the monolith or taking the existing architecture and breaking it down, introducing automation, right? I mean, that is a big thing, because without automation, a lot of these tools could not be used. And using feature toggles and branch by abstraction to decouple deployment and release. So all these things, it became very tool-centric kind of thing, where we went back and we started implementing in the right earnest. So everything started getting dictated by, we want to do this because we want to do continuous delivery, and nobody ever questioned why you want to do continuous delivery, right? Why do you want to release several hundred times in a day? So that was a scenario in 2013. Everyone was like, it was a hot thing, and everyone wanted to do it that way. But then anti-patterns 2016. So that all resulted into what obviously would result in it works on my PC. Give me access to production, I do it. We built 200 microservices. Come on, I mean, why you build 200 microservices and then forgot to set up Jenkins? We got fully automated deployment pipeline, but we release twice a year now. Business doesn't require you to release. Not every business is Netflix, so business doesn't require you to release that frequently. So but then why do you have fully automated deployment pipeline? Why you don't really need it, right? So these are some of the anti-patterns that evolved, and this is very, very common. We crammed this monolith in a container and called it a microservice.
Yeah, I can give you
all these things.
At a company I was working at, we were trying to push for even as frequently as like 6 to 12 week, 1 to 2 month type of range. And the sales and account management came back and said our customers can't afford to take that many releases because they have to train their employees and deal with the change on their end. And so I mean, you really do have to understand your customer base and factor that in.
I mean, if that is I can very well appreciate that. If that is the story with 6 to 12 weeks, one can imagine what your marketing people would have said if they had heard the Netflix story. So
every day. Yeah.
Some things are practical, some things are downright impractical, and we just have to follow what makes sense for the organization that you work for. So moving on, actually what it takes is the cultural integration of two teams, the development and the operations team. So you have to have collaboration, right? And that's more to do with that than of course you need tools, of course you need processes, of course you need frameworks, but to have that you have to have a solid foundation where development and operations team have to work together as a team and not have this wall of confusion between them where as you can see in this picture, developers build something, throw it over the wall and go off on the weekend, and operations has to worry on the weekend how it can be deployed in production. So moving on, solutions came up in 2016 that made sense. Automating deployment is not an afterthought. Start building it from day one. And some of the software resists portability. So when you choose software, check whether it is going to be portable. Decoupled components, we talked about it earlier. Immutable containers, we talked about it earlier. Don't treat your containers like virtual machines. So like most of the ops people are used to virtual machines, and they try to put everything there. Like, so containers are very, very thin, lightweight. So and all these, most of it we covered also in the 12-factor app, is the solution that finally kind of made sense in this. But Netflix kept coming back. In 2018, again, we talked about Netflix as a what they call as a chaos monkey. Chaos monkey is a program that turns off some services randomly and see how they recover. So whether your system is resilient enough. So that is the thought behind that. And then came the Simian army, which is not just the chaos monkey, but an entire set of programs which have not only turning off one service, but turning off entire zones or regions. And there are various roles that are assigned to these different programs, and that forms the Simian army. So that was the 2018. So some of the thoughts of Netflix made sense. A lot of what we do still is coming from Netflix, like Spring Cloud and all the libraries that came from Netflix are very useful, no doubt. And this is one part which, again, sort of makes sense, but it remains to be seen. And chaos engineering again talked about how things evolved there. And finally, this is the last 2017 sort where developers started doing microservices, and where microservices doing continuous deployment using microservices was much easier than deploying monoliths and doing continuous delivery and deployment with monoliths. So microservices have this inherent ability to be deployed in containers, and it's very push button kind of deployment, doesn't require much overhead. So it's more of developers doing it. So you don't really require a DevOps engineer to do it. So again, going back to the trend, all throughout we're talking is the developers doing the UX, it's the developers doing the architecture, it's the developers doing the DevOps, right? So as you can see, this trend, it carried through that, finally, I think we are going back to a situation where I'll show you in a slide later that developers are central. So, they assume most of the roles in an agile team going forward. So, now finally we talked about agile organization and culture, and you'll see the journey, how it evolved. It started in 2014 with T-shaped skills, where you have cross-functional teams, where you have every member doing multiple things, wearing multiple hats like QA, business analyst, ops, development. So all this, being taken care of by what we call as a very versatile developer who takes care of everything. So this thought was there already in 2014. So have cross-functional teams where one person can wear multiple hats, so you don't have really big teams. So have a team which is small, and in that one person can wear multiple hats. Way back in 2014, as it evolved. In 2015, there was a keynote address by James Tam. He talked about red zone and green zone, so which is about collaboration. Organizations which are extremely, so he has written a book called Radical Collaboration, and in that he covered how green organizations which are more collaborative are more profitable, and he's compared their net income, stock prices, revenues, and all these things. So what is common across these companies is one important thing is that you don't have defensiveness, you don't have CYA. So being defensive is the main problem that you have in the organizations, being protecting yourself. So actually what James says in his keynote here is defensiveness doesn't protect us from other people, it defends us from the fears we don't want to feel. So that is the thing that kind of stuck on, and many of the organizations that are successful that we saw, and we are following this throughout, that having collaboration and having a collaborative spirit is necessary. It lays the foundation for agile teams. Switching back, this is a diagram which I think finally concludes all that I said in the last 20 minutes or so. So in 1980s, we had developers doing everything, and around 2000 we had the tester and the developer, two different roles in the team. Around 2010, ops came and became a part of that. Today we have DevOps, QA, UX, and developers. But going forward, there's a lot of thinking about test engineering, where developers do the testing, test automation. So these two roles are now merging, and no ops, as we saw, even the DevOps is, with the advent of microservices, is being handled by developers. And in earlier sections, we also saw how the entire team is doing UX or UX design and UX research. So even developers are participating in the UX activity as well. So you're coming back full circle now, where whether it is UX or test engineering or DevOps or development itself, it's all being handled by developers. So are we going back? So with that thought, so this is a trend that we kind of saw over all these years, and this is a picture to just see where things are going.
Yeah, Vinayak.
Finally, I'm going to,
if I can interject, I am, in the clients that I'm working with, I'm seeing this trend, and I'm seeing a lot of resistance actually in the developer community and in the community at large. And I mean, this is one of the things. It's new and foreign in some of these cases, like developers doing testing, right? That's something that's never been on their plate before. I mean, they do it at a unit level, but like to ask them to do it at a more expanded level, it's new. It's not wrong. That's not my point, but it's new, and so there is some resistance in education and training, and maybe different tools and things that need to come along to make that really, if that's a real transition, make that happen.
right. And what we have seen is it's not the developers who would go on to become test engineers, but it's the QA professionals who become like developers. So I have seen QA professionals becoming very adept at writing code, and even doing static analysis and talking about doing code reviews. And that's the way things are changing. But you're right, there is some level of resistance in the developers to switch to the new test engineering job. But the test engineers themselves are now, some of them are even better than developers at development. So
yeah, I've definitely seen
and that the trend that we are going to see more of that. Similarly for DevOps, I've seen that with cloud and with everything, all configuration as code happening, it's the developers who are or the DevOps professionals who are so good, they become more like developers and start writing better code. So it's one of the two things that is happening. But finally, they all start looking alike. Is what I think is going to happen. This is again, I would say, the trend, and it's yet to be seen whether it happens or not.
Well,
So lastly, I would like to,
if you circle back to the T concept, I mean, it makes sense that this is the way that it would work out, right? As everyone is cross-functional and can do various different roles depending on what's needed, and that would be very helpful in most organizations.
Right, and it started way back in 2014. So someone thought about it then. Mm-hmm. Right. So lastly, I talk about some grand ideas that didn't make it. So craftsmanship. So there was in 2010 a lot of talk about craftsmanship, kata, randori, mikado, mob programming, and we were thinking that let's practice, and we tried some of this. Tried it in our organization. It kind of worked, but it never took root. Mob programming, Woody Zuil and his experiments at Hunter Industries, there was a lot of discussion about it. It made sense, kind of, but it still remains to be seen whether it doesn't become mainstream. It's only once in a while that we can do it. It can be as a part of a brainstorming exercise. Self-organization, again, in 2014, there was a trade me case study where you gather in a room and put up various projects on the wall, and then developers move around and they go, and it's a self-selection process where they pick up the project they would like to work on. Yeah, I mean, theory it is okay. Also, there's a book written by Heidi. So this is about dynamic reteaming, the same old wine in a new bottle. It's called dynamic reteaming. It kind of makes sense, but practically it's very difficult to have people move from one project team to another. They talk about mobility of teams and all that, but really speaking, it never took off.
Yeah, so one thing when I can
So
dynamic reteaming,
are big, but never too pop.
so when I can dynamic reteaming, it seems that cross purpose to with what we said earlier about stable and dedicated teams, right? Some of the data suggests stable and dedicated teams are more productive and predictable, and if you do dynamic reteaming, you obviously are breaking that. So that's an interesting contrast.
Yeah, but there is a thought that there has to be talent mobility. So you need to not let people stagnate and have them, the freedom to move to something new. So it's all good in theory, but in practice, as you rightly said, Heyman, you need stability, right? I mean, you have relationships, and you can't just break those relationships, because finally an organization is made of relationships.
Yeah. Fair enough.
Yeah, I think part of the concept that is still valuable is just how do you introduce that change, which is inevitable, without hurting productivity too much in the short term, which is interesting theory that's still evolving, I'm sure.
Thanks, Mike.
All right. So with that, I think we're done with the content for today. Just want to remind everyone that if you do have questions about what you've heard today, please reach out to any one of us, Vinayak, Hemant, or myself, or you can reach out to the marketing team, however you want to do it. We will get to all the questions that have been submitted and share those out in some form as soon as possible. Again, thanks for joining us for this ZipChat, slightly different format. Next time we'll be back to the regular format. One last thing is our next upcoming webinar is going to be on October 10th, and it's the topic of fixing broken teams, throughput on a budget. It's my topic. I should know exactly what I wrote, but yes, I'm going to be the presenter in that particular webinar with someone else from SynerZip moderating in that case. Again, thanks everyone for joining. Appreciate you bearing through this new format, and hope you enjoyed the content. Any feedback on the content is more than welcome. Have a great rest of the day. Bye, everyone.